What's up everybody, this is Meher, and in this video we are going to learn about implicit binding for this keyword. So this is the part 2 of the first video, and in the part 1 we learned about how default binding works for this keyword. So we might be using some references from the part 1, so if you have not checked the first video out, then I'll recommend you check it out. You probably can find the link on the screen right now, or I'll be dropping in a link in the description as well. So now let's look at a code example and try to understand how implicit binding works. So the primary idea here is that, let's say if you have a function and you invoke that function as a method of an object, then the value of this is going to be the object from which the method is being invoked. So let's look at an example and try to get this. Okay, so let's begin by creating a simple object. Let's call this object person. Let's attach a property to it and some value to it, and then let's create a new function which will invoke as a method, and this function is going to do a simple thing. It will log the value for the property name on the console, and that's our function here. And let me complete this. Okay, so now the implicit binding definition says if you invoke a method of an object, then this value will be the object from which the method was invoked. So the idea is simple. So in this case, if I say person.getName, what I'm going to get back is the value Meher, and this was because this keyword was attached to this object, and that's how your implicit binding works. But there are so many different parts to it. For example, you need not necessarily have the method name or the function within the object itself. So what I mean by that is, let's say I create a similar object like this, but instead of this, let's say create a function which is again getName, and this function also does the same thing, which is console.log this.name. So the method does not have to be on the object, it can be any function, but once you attach a function to the object body, then if you invoke that function as a method of the object, then again you're going to get back the same value. So in our case, let's say if I say person dot okay, let me call this getName is equal to getName, and then let's say if I say person dot getName and I invoke this function, what I get back again is value Meher. So in this case, what we did differently was we created a different function altogether. This is not now a method which we created, but later on what we did is we said, okay, now this person object will create a method called as getName, and will store the function which we have created here onto the method of the object. And when we invoke this method getName from the person object, the value for this again gets attached to the person object, and that's how we get the value Meher from this function. So if you look at what just happened, the whole idea here is that it does not matter where you have defined your function. It completely depends on how the function was invoked, and in both the cases the function was invoked from a reference point of an object, and that's why the value of this keyword was getting attached to the object. And this is what basically your implicit binding is. But now we are going to look at a couple of exceptions that make this implicit binding a little tricky, but it's not that difficult. It's just something that we have to keep in mind when we are working with implicit binding. Okay, now let's work with the same object, and let's see this new scenario where things can start to look slightly different. So now, instead of logging the name, I'm just logging the object so that we get to see what the object reference is. So now let's create a simple function, call it speak, and I'm going to log this. Okay, let me just log this in this case and keep the logging pretty simple. And what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to invoke this function speak, and yes, so this object is nothing different than what we have done, except we have added a new function over here. And And now when we invoke this function or invoke this method getName, we are going to see something really weird that happens. For example, for this log statement, the first log statement, it gives us the object person. But the second log statement is printing the window. And why is that? You should recall the rule that the value of this completely depends on how the invocation was done. And if you see here, the invocation is absolutely not indicating any kind of a reference. So the function speak has no idea what to do with this keyword. And that's when it falls back absolutely to the window object, because that seems to be the most reasonable response what JavaScript can give you. So now let's look at the second weird part of the implicit binding, or rather I'd say a part or a behavior that we should keep in our mind. And for that, what we'll have to do is we'll have to create a new variable. That means we have to come up with a new name for it. So, okay, I think let's call it person name. And now what we are going to do is we are going to say person.getName. And this is something that we can do in JavaScript. We can pass around functions. And there's this one video in which I covered the idea that functions are values. So if you have not checked that out, you can check it out in order to get more understanding. But what we are simply doing here is we are just storing the function or the method in the variable person name, and we are going to invoke it later. And that's a feature which JavaScript gives you. So let's do that. So with this, now we have stored getName inside person name. And we might expect that if we invoke person name, then the output should be for the first console log statement, the person object, but that's not going to be the case. So let's see this behavior. So if I invoke this, now both the reference or both the value for this keyword is the window object. So now we can see that for both the invocations, the output for this keyword turned out to be the window object. And why is that? The answer is simple. That is how we invoke the function. And the function invocation was done in a very regular manner, which is very much similar to how default binding invocation is done. And that's why this keyword was bound to the window object. And if we look at, let me clear the console. So how is it done? Control L, I guess. Yeah. So if I do not invoke the variable where we stored the function, and if I just use this to log what is in the person name, you're going to see that it's just a simple function body. Now this function body has absolutely no information about what the object was, because when we took that function or the method and we stored it in a variable, JavaScript did not store any reference for the object in that new variable. So there's no way for JavaScript to know where this function is coming from, except for the fact that it just took the function body and kept it in a different variable altogether. And that should give us an answer that why, when we are invoking the person name, we get this value bound to the window object, because this is absolutely just like a regular function. We used it in the default binding video. So now that we are talking about objects, how can we not talk about the prototype chain? So we are not going to go much deeper into it, but let's just understand this topic as an aspect of two objects which are linked together, and what happens to this keyword if we are invoking method from the prototype chain. So let me create an example quickly for you guys. So let's say if I have an object 1, and let's say this object 1 has a function which is called as getName, and this function is basically going to do the same thing like the previous functions have done. They will get the value of name from this keyword. Whatever this keyword, we are going to keep it. Now let me create object 2. So for simplicity, we are going to skip what exactly object.create does, but if you want to understand it simply, we are basically linking to object so that object 2 can have access to object 1's data, properties, and whatnot. And now what we are going to do is we are going to say object2.name. Basically an object was created for object 2 and it got linked to object 1. There are a lot many details to it, but we'll keep it really simple here. And I'm going to again say Meher will be the value for the name property on this. And now when I say object2.getName, we are going to get the value Meher. So this is also something that happens with implicit binding. So even if you have an a method in the prototype chain and you're invoking it from a different object or an object that is linked to the other object, then again the binding for this keyword becomes attached to the object which was used as the invocation for the method, and that's what we did here. And now let's look at the final part of the object, which is basically your getter and setter functions, and the rule is pretty much simple over there. It's as good as how we did this example. So let's say instead of using a method, let's say we create a property and your getter function is basically a property which gets bound to a function, and whenever we do a property lookup on that object, the function is invoked. So it's so we'll see how the invocation is done, because it looks more like a property but a function gets invoked, and in that case this keyword behaves pretty consistently. So there's no weird aspect or another rule that we have to remember. So let's say if I have okay, I'm writing a very weird name over here for the lack of better name, and you will see that okay, this looks good. This is okay. All right, so that's how we create our getter function. And now what we are going to do is, let's say if I say person dot person name, really weird name, and you're going to get back the value meher, and that is what your getter function is. So your getter function basically is a property, but it's bound to a function, and your function gets invoked, so you don't have to write the parenthesis in order to invoke the function which is bound to the property. So that is it for implicit binding, and if you notice, there were 3 sections to it, and the behavior for this keyword in these 3 sections was absolutely consistent, except for one part where if you took the method from the object and you stored it in a variable and then you decided later on to invoke that variable, in that case the variable has no idea where this method came from, and that's why the binding for this keyword gets lost in that particular situation. But in case of prototype chain, in case of your getter and setter function and regular invocation of your method, the value for this keyword stays pretty consistent. So this was the part 2 of understanding this keyword's binding, and the part 1 was about default binding. So if you have not checked it out, I'd recommend check it out. I'll have probably the link in the description, or the link is probably on the screen right now. And if you have any questions related to this keyword, then feel free to drop a comment and I'll try to answer your question. And as usual, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know what you would want me to cover next in JavaScript.